with kind of antecedent conditions. So for the last 12 months, so May 2018 to April 2019, these are the statewide precipitation rankings. You can see for much of the north central and eastern part of the US, there's a lot of green on this image. So a lot of states are much above average precipitation rankings for over this 12-month time period. And several states in our region are record wettest. So it has been wet overall leading up to where we are now. 2019 year to date, this is a statewide average temperature rankings, keeping in mind that locations within a given state might be different than what the statewide average is. But here it just shows an overall pattern of below average temperatures going back to January through April of this year. This information is available from the National Centers for Environmental Information, so it's updated once a month. A state that stands out here, South Dakota, was 11th coldest on record going back to 1895 over this particular time period. So we've been wet for the last 12 months. We've been cool overall for much of the region going back to January. If we look at statewide precipitation rankings over that same time period, so January through April of 2019, lots of green on the map. Much above average to much above average for many states in our region, top 10 wettest for several states. We can look at April in particular, and again, keeping in mind that clearly there's variability, there's ups and downs in both temperature and precipitation throughout the month. But this is how the month overall ranked in terms of temperature. There's a little bit of warm, so above average temperatures for kind of the southern tier of the central part of the US, and near average temperatures for kind of the north central part of our region here. So that's how April temperatures panned out. And for precipitation, these are the statewide precipitation rankings for the month of April. It's kind of a mix of conditions throughout the region. So North Dakota, Iowa, and Missouri were near average for the month of April, and kind of states in the northern and eastern part of our region, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, those were all in the above average category for April precipitation. And then there was a little bit drier pocket. Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado were in the below average category or ranking for April precipitation. So that's how April panned out. We look at the last 30 days, there's a bit of a difference here. If we look at temperatures in particular, so this is a departure from normal, and so much of the region, particularly in the central and northern parts of the region, mostly cooler than normal by a few degrees over the last 30 days. But parts of southern Wyoming and western Colorado and parts of Ohio, a little bit of Missouri as well, ranked in the above average temperatures overall. Precipitation trend over the last 30 days. So here I'm showing the total precipitation over the last 30 days. That's in the upper right image. And so if you notice in the highlighted area, the kind of the black oval there, the precipitation totals are 5 inches or greater. So that was certainly the wet part of the region. And if you, in the lower left, you see the graphic of a departure from normal precipitation. So you can see those departures are upwards, 3 to even 4 inches more than normal over the last 30 days. But looking to the kind of the northern and western part of the region where it was relatively dry over the last 30 days. So not a lot to talk about, as you would expect. For the U.S. Drought Monitor, we're at historically low coverage. Here we're showing the National Weather Service Central region, even zooming out to the entire U.S. We're at very low coverage in terms of drought. There's a small pocket of drought in north central Wyoming. And then the other pockets of D0 or abnormally dry are in a few parts of the region. They're in northern North Dakota and then portions of the west into Montana, Wyoming, and portions of Colorado, and then into southwest Nebraska, where it's been a bit dry over the longer term. So only a couple of pockets of abnormal dryness. And just to kind of illustrate those pockets of dryness here, we're looking at the precipitation trend going back to the water year, or October of 2018 to the present. This is this precipitation total is viewed in terms of a percent of normal. So anywhere it's green or a cooler color, that is above normal precipitation. And what I've highlighted are those pockets of dryness that we're watching. So that's in the kind of 50 to 70% of normal. So you can see those areas that stand out and those areas that are highlighted on the U.S. Drought Monitor. But clearly for the most part of the region, we're above normal in the 150 to percent or so. Okay, so also, as you would expect, given how much precipitation that we've received kind of leading up to now into the fall and winter, this is looking at soil moisture, and this is an anomaly, and it's a metric unit, so it's millimeters there. This is a product that's updated, I want to say daily, I believe, or weekly perhaps. This image happens to be from May 10th, and the URL there is below, so you can get up-to-date information there. And again, I've highlighted kind of the drier parts of the region, but you can see how anomalously wet most of the region is. And we'll hit on this point a couple of times during this webinar. If we look at it in terms of a percentile ranking, where there's a lot of green on this map, there's a large swath that's in the 99th percentile. So in terms of ranking, we're looking at fairly historic. We're looking at one end of the distribution here in terms of wetness. So the soil profile is at or near saturation for many areas across the region. Looking at snowpack conditions, generally the trend is more in the south and less in the north. This is a current snow water equivalent percent of normal that just came out this morning. So anything in those warmer colors are kind of 70% of normal, a little bit less than what there should be for this time of year. And then anything in the blue colors there would be above normal. So you can see those basins in Colorado and Wyoming are running 160, 200% of normal, 120 or so percent of normal, and then a bit less once you get into Wyoming and areas further north. So in terms of snowpack, it's looking pretty good in Colorado and endpoints north as well. All right, so in terms of the basin conditions, if we look at certain points along the Missouri River, we're looking at the 1981 to 2010 average, so the average over the last 30 years, and how this season ranks in terms of mountain snowpack water content. So on the left, we have the total above Fort Peck, which is in Montana, and then total of mountain snowpack water equivalent, Fort Peck to Garrison, which is in North Dakota. So you can see we're on where we are mid-May, so we're on the decline in terms of snowmelt. Peak occurred on April 18th at about 105% of the normal April 15th peak. That was at Fort Peck. And then looking on the right-hand side, Fort Peck to Garrison, the peak occurred on April 17th. That's 104% of the normal April 15th peak. So you can see kind of where this season stacks up to the average value. So if we go further south, here we're looking at the North Platte and the South Platte basins. So how much water content is in those snowpacks? Again, you can see we're on the decline to that snowmelt curve. So For the North Platte, 72% of the peak snow water equivalent is remaining. In the South Platte, 91% of the peak snow water equivalent is remaining. Okay, so here's looking at a kind of occurrence of spring and when did the leaf out occur. So this is from the National Phenology Network, where you can get up-to-date information. So this image was pulled a few days ago. So the areas in blue, it was later than average. The areas in red, leaf out was earlier than average. So you can see kind of a nice, almost a frontal boundary there, kind of in the southern part of the U.S., where most of the area here in the Central Plains, leaf out was a few weeks later than average, which could be expected given kind of the overall cooler conditions leading up to this spring. So we'll transition now to some impacts here, and something that is, I'm probably stating obvious here, it's wet in most places, it's really wet in a lot of places, and we'll get more into that here as we go forward. Flooding certainly remains a concern going forward. So you'll hear from Jim with the with the National Weather Service here in just a bit. I'll cover some information dealing with lake levels that are high. We heard from Minnesota state climatologists there that lake levels are generally high for the lakes in Minnesota, and Great Lakes, Lake Erie and Superior in particular, are at record high levels. Planting, as you would expect, and as some of you probably are well aware that are on this webinar, planting is delayed. The issue of prevent plant is something that is being discussed. So there's certainly a lot of widespread agricultural impacts this season. We've heard multiple reports from across the region of issues with low forage quantity as well as quality around the region. We're hearing that in parts of Ohio, parts of South Dakota, and in Illinois as well. Okay, so I'll get into some of the agricultural products here from USDA. So this is from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, the weekly crop progress and condition. So winter wheat, in terms of condition, for areas in the west, you can see they're in green, which is a higher percent of winter wheat that is rated in the percent good to excellent condition. This is as of about 4 days ago. And so the top number there, I'll pick on Nebraska since I'm from here. So 67% of winter wheat in Nebraska is rated in the good to excellent category. The bottom number is the change from last year. So that's up 3% when compared to 2018. So for Nebraska, South Dakota, Montana, Colorado, and points south, more than 50% of the wheat is rated good to excellent condition. It's not as good in areas further to the east, kind of on the other side of the Missouri there, where Missouri, Illinois, and Ohio, they're 30-some% of the winter wheat is in the good to excellent category. So majority of the wheat is in the fair to poor category. In terms of progress, not a lot for much of the region. So this is the percent headed. So that's the top number. So you can see for kind of the northern portion of the region, Nebraska, South Dakota, Michigan, there's not a lot widespread progress throughout the state. In the bottom number there, you can see the percent change, and that's from the 5-year average as opposed to last year. So for Nebraska, only 2% headed, and that's down 10 points from the previous 5-year average. Kansas kind of sticks out here. The percent headed is at 35%, and that's a decrease or a decline of about 30% from the previous 5 years. Then areas to the east, you can see Missouri, 51%, Illinois, 35%, and so forth, and how that compares to the 5-year average. Okay, so some pretty dismal numbers, and looking at planting progress, I'll show corn and soybean, as well as sugar beets and a few other crops here. So as of a few days ago, corn progress on a statewide basis here, we're looking at some pretty low numbers, and especially when compared to the 5-year average here. Some states that really stand out here, Illinois in particular, only 11% planted, which is 70% behind the 5-year average. Indiana, 6% planted, and that's 50% behind the 5-year average. Ohio at 4%, that's 43% behind the 5-year average. Minnesota and South Dakota, those are also 44 and 50% respectively behind the 5-year average. Some states have made some progress, and I understand that folks are certainly taking advantage of these warm sunny days where we get a little bit of drying out in the fields that are not underwater. You can at least get out into them, get prepped and get things planted. But overall, pretty dismal this year in terms of planting progress for corn. If we look at soybean, the numbers are somewhat similar. The change from the 5-year average is not quite as stark as for corn, but so Nebraska is at about 20% planted for soybean. That's about 12% behind the 5-year average. Minnesota is at 3%. That's 30% behind the 5-year average. Illinois, Indiana, they're just a few percent planted, which is 30 and 25% behind the 5-year average. So, really the overall message, as you would expect, just given the saturated soil conditions, the inability to get in the field, the inability to get fields prepped and get fields planted is certainly an issue this year. A couple of other crops here. So spring wheat for the U.S., in the upper left-hand image, so the percent planted in South Dakota is 46%, and that is 42% change from the 5-year average. Minnesota is at 35% planted. That's 33% behind the 5-year average. And the other values for the other states, there, North Dakota, Montana, and so forth, are similar. And looking at sugar beets there in the lower right, North Dakota is at 64% planted. That's 13% behind the 5-year average. Minnesota is at 54%. That's 20% behind. And Michigan's at 46% planted, and that's 37% behind the 5-year average. So again, really the same message here. Things are behind in terms of getting planted. Okay, so some other impacts around the region. So if you remember from one of my earlier slides, I showed the previous 12 months precipitation rankings, the statewide rankings, and we've been wet for a while now, and one of the things that's leading to is Great Lakes levels that are either above record heights or approaching record heights. And I believe Lakes Erie and Superior are above the previous record high in terms of lake levels. So impacts to this would be increased flooding, as well as increased erosion potential when we do have storms that move through the area. So the image in the lower left there is looking at Lake Erie water levels. This is from a location in Ohio, and it's showing you several different curves there. On the red is the average level for last year, 2018. The previous record is in kind of the cyan color, the bright turquoise color. And what you'll note is that in 2019, we've kind of been marching up over the last month and a half or so, and so we've exceeded the previous record. So some imagery that was sent to me. This is from a newspaper out of Toledo. Just some impacts that we're seeing from these very high lake levels. Okay, another kind of staying with the lakes here, another impact would be the harmful algal bloom. Heavy spring rains and large phosphorus loads projected to cause harmful algal bloom for Lake Erie. So there's a true color image from NASA, I believe, taken a few days ago in the bottom left. The brown color is sediment, and then the green color is the harmful algal bloom. In the right-hand side of the image there, that's the prediction for the bloom severity. So you can see over time what the harmful algal bloom has been and what the likely range is for this year going forward. So, some issues here with these harmful algal blooms, given the heavy rains that we've had and the wetness issues. Okay, so we've had some pretty stark news here, but there's some silver linings. There's some good things that are happening, particularly if you look at the western part of our region. The grass production is generally going quite well, and I just wanted to point your attention to a tool that looks at grass productivity. It's called GrassCast. And the images that you're seeing here, it's looking at the seasonal outlook at May, June, July, August precipitation. And the image on the left, if we assume that that we have above normal precipitation through the spring and summer, then your above ground net primary productivity for this year compared to the average, you can see lots of blue in that image there on the left. So you can see kind of above average productivity in terms of grass production, kind of here in the western part of the region. And I'll get to the outlooks here in a minute, but kind of set your sights on the image there on the left. The image on the right, that is assuming that we have normal precipitation from May through August. So even if we have normal precipitation amounts, the grass productivity is generally kind of in the green to turquoise to blue colors here. So pretty good grass production, given that we've had a fair amount of moisture for this area. So that's kind of one positive here. Another positive would be, I heard reports from Colorado, pretty good Rocky Mountain Snowpack that is filling reservoirs. So that's certainly a good thing to hear and good news for them. Well, so going forward, precipitation forecast for the next week does not look great. The soil profiles are full to saturated. We've been wet overall. We've generally been cool overall. We know that planting is already delayed. And over the next week, kind of the area that I've highlighted in black is the prediction is in the 3 to 5 inch range. So pretty active pattern. It's looking like setting up a kind of a trough in the west and a ridge in the east. And these forecasts have been pretty consistent, which gives you some higher confidence in the forecast actually verifying. So certainly something to look out for in terms of impacts over the next week. If we look at hazards, so NOAA also puts out kind of these hazards and threats. Here we're looking at for the period May 18th through the 22nd, precipitation hazards only. And I've underlined the 3 primary precipitation hazards. So heavy rain is the very large areas in green. So that, something that we need to look out for on the horizon. Flooding occurring or imminent, that's in the purple color, which looks a little bit gray when it's under the green color. So that's the shading kind of in those basins, kind of in South Dakota, parts of Minnesota, and then kind of along the Mississippi there, Iowa and Illinois. And another thing to look out for is severe weather. That's in orange, so kind of for the southern plains. Again, this active pattern with potential for severe weather and impacts related to severe weather. And if we separate out and look at temperature, so going forward, cooler than normal in the northern portions of the region. And so can think about kind of some impacts to ag production if things are late getting into the ground and we're starting out cool, and so we're not accumulating a lot of growing degree day. The soils will be kept a bit on the cooler side and not accumulating a lot of growing degree days here in the next week or so.
Hey, Martha, would you back up 2 slides from there? Yeah, one more. One more. There you go. So this is over the next week. This is over the next 7 days. I just want to double what Martha has just said. Go to the next slide then. And this is looking forward to the next week beyond that. Okay. That whole greenish area, as Martha said, is more or less under the gun for excessive precipitation, or I guess heavy precipitation. That's 2 weeks in a row. I don't have the timing on all of these things. We can discuss that a little bit later. Just wanted to say that the next 2 weeks are going to be especially interesting from a heavy precipitation point of view.
Doug, sorry, this is 3 to 7 day also. This is not the following.
Oh, this is 3 to 7. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Sorry, that's right. That's right, Dennis. Go ahead. Sorry. On you go.
Okay. This might have been what you were thinking next. So outlook. So May 23rd to 29th. So on the left, we're looking at temperature probabilities. On the right is precipitation probabilities. So cool in the wet, increased chances for cooler than normal in the west, warmer than normal in the east. So again, kind of this trough and ridge pattern here. So to go along with this, there's a big swath of green that you see in the precipitation outlook. So probabilities are in the wetter than normal category here. So something that only exacerbates the issues that we're already dealing with. So this takes us out to the end, almost the end of May. That's the 8 to 14 day outlook. I'm just gonna kind of slip in here El Nino, because next I'll go to the monthly and seasonal predictions. And obviously El Nino is something that is a factor in there and looked at in terms of temperature and precipitation trends seasonally going forward. So currently in an El Nino pattern, and by season is on the bottom part of the graphic. So this goes April, May, June. This is about, so early May is when this came out. So going across the bottom again, May, June, July, August. And so 3-month time periods, stepping forward in time. So the El Nino is predicted to last through summer. The probabilities do decrease once we get into winter, but El Nino does have the highest probability of the 3 different categories. And so now I'll go to the outlooks that were just released this morning. So for June, which is similar to what the May outlooks look like. So continued higher probability for below normal temperatures for a swath in the central US, whereas kind of surrounding that blue area is equal chances in the above, near normal, and below normal temperature category. This is combined with the increased probability of wetter than normal conditions for June. And keeping in mind that late spring, early summer, that's, for some areas, this is kind of the wettest time of year. So we're increasing the chances that the wettest time of year will be even more wetter. So that's the June outlook. Unfortunately, I don't, these predictions continue if we go into June, July, and August. So the cooler than normal kind of blob in the central US there on the left for the temperature probabilities, that kind of expands, covering much of the central portion of this region. And then this is combined with the increased chance of being in the wetter than normal category for precipitation as well. So kind of this continuation of cooler and wetter conditions going out through the August time period. So as you would expect, there's not a lot of change or even drought removal for going forward. This product was released last month, but it's going out through the end of July. And you can see for terms of drought conditions, the areas in the west will likely either improve or be removed. So just to summarize my portion of this talk before I turn it over to Jim. So planting and development, both planting and development is well behind schedule for all crops. Missouri River Basin runoff in the upper reaches predicted to be the third highest in 120 years. I didn't necessarily cover this in particular, but it was kind of a highlight that that was sent to me by some hydrology folks, and I thought this was an important thing to cover. And again, you'll hear more in just a minute about this. So the main points here in terms of impacts, the short and long-term outlook are not favorable for alleviating the current agricultural and hydrological impacts. Significant precipitation totals are expected in the upcoming week, and this will fall on wet and/or saturated soils. The likelihood for cooler, wetter summer and possible impacts to crops that are planted late, like I mentioned earlier, is that it's going to be slow in terms of development. We could be entering into a prevent plant scenario. So there's a lot of chatter and a lot of discussion about kind of when these decisions need to be made here, and how much of a broad scale will it be in terms of prevent plant, as well as adjustments in seed. Should there be a switch to a shorter season or a different variety of seeds, and will that become an issue in terms of availability if it happens at a broad scale? So just wanted to summarize my portion, and then I will turn it over to look at a hydrology perspective.
All right, thank you, Martha. This is Jim Knoll. I'm at the National Weather Service Ohio River Forecast Center. And we'll be talking a little bit about hydrology, soil conditions, and the river outlooks coming over the next several weeks and even into the beginning of summer. The big highlight is, as Martha has been talking about, we are wet in the middle of the country. Most of the area is in the top 1 to 10 percentile rank on this image, especially, again, east of the Rockies. And that makes us vulnerable to future rainfall and runoff conditions. Most studies do indicate that a significant portion of the rainfall, once we get into later May and especially June and July, can recycle on itself. And so that can add to additional rainfall. On most of these slides, I do have links to whatever images I do show on here as well, and highlighted in the orange at the bottom of the image. If we move on to the next slide then, what we're going to be looking at here in terms of our current flood forecast is generally we have been seeing improving conditions in the middle of the country, in the Missouri, Mississippi, and Ohio river basins as a whole, and into the Great Lakes. We do still have some lingering moderate to major flooding in portions of the Big Sioux and James River basins in South Dakota, but again, most of that currently is receding. Further to the east in the upper Mississippi basin, we do have moderate to major flooding lingering in those colors of the reds and the purples downstream of the Quad Cities, Davenport, Iowa, on the Mississippi River, and we also have in the lower portion of the Illinois River in Illinois still some moderate to major flooding. Elsewhere, in the oranges, you see some scattered minor flooding, and then in the yellow would be just below flood stage kind of areas. So things are, in this very short term, have been improving some. If we move on to the next slide, it's really about what's coming up, and it looks like the weather pattern, as Martha was talking about, is going to reactivate. This is what the river forecast centers use to generate some of their forecasts, not on our daily basis. Generally, we use 1 to 2 days of future rainfall, but we also do some planning forecasts and that. And this is a 16-day averaged out rainfall forecast, and those areas in red are above 5 inches for basically just over a 2-week total. And so the primary area that you'll see is the Missouri into portions of the upper Mississippi Basin and into the Great Lakes, and then in the northern Ohio Valley, where significant rainfall is expected not only over the next week, as Martha was showing, but really over the next 2 weeks, as we have a parade of storm systems. Really, this is the same as we were talking about back really in March. We have a parade of storm systems that have been just energetic, coming all the way off of Asia through the North Pacific into North America in the U.S. and Canada. And nothing looks like that's going to change over the next several weeks as we continue to have a significant number of storm systems that will be marching through the central and western U.S. So the primary threat then is that we are expecting a growing risk of heavy rain in portions of the Missouri and upper Mississippi basins, and some of that may move over into the northern Ohio basin as well. Moving on to the next slide. So how does this all equate in the additional risk for flooding over the coming weeks? And this is looking at at least a 50% probability of flood conditions in the central U.S. Orange would be minor flooding, red, moderate flooding, purple is major flooding. And so what this indicates is there's at least 50% chance of some renewed flooding in portions of the eastern Missouri into the upper Mississippi Basin, and down into even portions of the middle Mississippi Valley and the western Ohio Valley as well. So there is at least a 50% chance. That's why it's very important to listen to later forecasts over the coming weeks to get the exact details, depending on what location you're near. If we move on to the next slide, I wanted to just highlight that was a 50% chance of occurrence. You'll see much more color show up on this. And this is our long-range planning outlook by the National Weather Service, River Forecast Centers. And this is a 25% chance, or what's possible. And again, you'll see a lot more widespread minor to moderate flooding in the orange and reds, and even some renewed potential. There's a possibility of some additional major flooding in portions of the eastern Missouri into the upper Mississippi Basin, as well as portions of the middle Mississippi Basin as well. The Ohio Basin looks to stay more in the minor to maybe moderate flood categories in the western portion of the basin. But the bottom line is the heavy rainfall and the series of storm systems over the next really 2+ weeks will likely result in renewed flooding across the Midwest and especially in the eastern Missouri into the upper Mississippi basins, possibly again into the middle Mississippi, as well as the western Ohio basins. If we move on to the next slide then, kind of to wrap this all up, again, due to the current very wet conditions and high water content in the soils, most of the region is really vulnerable to these future storm systems, okay? Flooding is currently receding across most of our area, but the active weather pattern will be renewing here in the coming days and really last for the next several weeks, particularly in the eastern Missouri, upper Mississippi, middle Mississippi Basin, and western Ohio River Basin systems. There is at least a 50% chance of renewed flooding for those areas, and there is at least a 25% chance of not only renewed flooding, but potentially significant flooding in portions of the Missouri and upper Mississippi basins. So it's very important for you to listen to future forecasts and outlooks. And of course, the National Weather Service, we will be continuing to monitor the flood risk conditions. And finally, on the last slide here, before I turn it back to Doug and Martha, this is just a link to showing where you can get the long-range outlooks as well as the official river forecasts. And any of the contacts that you need from the River Forecast Centers, there are email addresses there. So with that, I'll turn it back to Doug and Martha for any comments and questions.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I'll just end with this slide here. So links to where you can get today's presentation and some other information that was used in pulling the information together for this webinar, you can find here. So I guess we will now open it up for questions.
Yes, hold on just a minute. I'm trying to expand my window here a little bit. All right. Yeah, we had some good questions. Dennis and or Martha. Well, actually, Martha, you get first crack at this unless you want Dennis to do it. Can you explain what prevent planting is?
Yeah, Dennis can. I'll start, and then Dennis can finish or correct me. He's probably got a much better indication than I do. But it's when conditions prevent you from getting into the field in planting, and so it's a way that you can ensure your losses if you're just not able to get into the field at all. And Dennis, if you want to kind of fill in some details there.
Sure, you get the basic of it right, Martha. It's a crop insurance product available across the upper Midwest. It was actually an outcome of the floods in '93. The situation is if your conditions are too wet to be able to plant, instead of trying to mud them in, which is bad for your soil, you can get a settlement, and you can't just claim it, you have to be able to prove it. You can get a settlement where you don't plant or do anything. There are several rules that go along with it. So the whole goal is to give some people an opportunity, if they can't plant, to be able to some kind of a settlement. The other side of it is that if it's excessively dry, you can claim that also. It's a harder one to prove than excessively wet. And the situation right now is we are starting to come up on those dates, because there are set planting dates that you have to plant before to be able to claim prevent plant. And the first of those dates are not too far off, the further north areas in the Corn Belt. And you don't completely lose coverage after those dates, but then you start losing coverage when we reach the first of those dates.
All right. Thank you, Dennis and Martha. First of all, I should have also said thank you to both Jim and Martha for even doing this. But back to the questions. Are there concerns about yield loss due to planting through a significant portion of the Midwestern plains?
Yes, I would say yes. That's the feedback that we're getting from various states. I mean, we're in a case where we're much later. So yes, I would certainly say that. And given the outlooks for cooler and wetter conditions, is those growing degree day accumulations in general are it's looking like it's not what it would be for even an average summer. So I would certainly say that yield loss is it's something that's on people's minds.
I'll throw in a couple more pieces here. We are, as of now, I think Martha mentioned this, the third latest planting for corn since 1993. All four of the latest ones ended up with yield losses by the end of the year. 1993 was the largest of those. I'd have to remember what the other ones are. 2011, I believe, was another one. So we're expecting it's very likely to have some yield loss, which is a per acre. The other issue that comes into marketing and crop prices and a number of different things is the overall production loss, because acres that do not get planted will end up not yielding anything. So that goes to a loss in overall production. And a yield loss on a per acre basis also leads to a lack of production. And how that leads into marketing and a number of other issues is quite complicated right now. And point people to their local extension economist to talk more about that. But yield loss is a definite possibility right now.
Okay, I think one of you referred to growing degree days, and I want to just say that for a number of issues, even besides agriculture, just a lot of things growing out there, and I'm sure ecosystems as well, is that the cooler than normal temperatures that we've seen so far and those that are predicted, okay, especially in the plains, in terms of higher probabilities below normal temperatures, will sort of exacerbate the fact that the precipitation that we will get and the precipitation that we've already had in terms of the soil moisture and such won't be as quickly as evaporated as you might have seen in the past, and it certainly hasn't so far this year. Does anybody want to expand on that at all in terms of temperatures not being above normal as opposed to be, yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to say. Okay. What is causing, okay, this is a very sort of loaded question. And what is causing the abnormal high precipitation in the north central region? In short, what is causing the rain is that there's a lot of ability to advect or move moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico north into this region. And when you can do that, if you can sustain that sort of, there's a pattern that sets up a trough or a low pressure system in the western U.S., and sort of this subtropical or ridge, if you will, over the southeast, where it's actually getting quite dry right now. Those two systems can set up such that the flow out of the Gulf of Mexico pumps a lot of moisture north into our area. And if you have enough cold fronts, which we will, and enough storm systems, as Jim and Martha both referred to, it's going to wring out a lot of moisture during that time. So there's this continuous, if you will, pump of moisture into the area. And then there's these systems, we call them storm systems, whatever you want to call them, moving through the area, able to wring out that moisture over the same areas over and over again. It is spring and it is the rainiest time of year, but when we show you maps with above normal precipitation probabilities, even during these times, that means that's quite a bit of rainfall for the most part coming down. So,
and Doug, to go along with that, and Jim also alluded to this, that it's not only bringing more moisture up from the Gulf, there's lots of moisture around that can be reinjected in the storm systems to produce more rainfall.
Yeah, and that becomes more efficient the warmer it gets as well. So as summer, it will get warmer in the summer. It's not going to say 60 and 70 degrees forever around here. It'll get to 80s, it'll get to 90s, but we probably won't see excessive temperatures, certainly, at least for long periods of time, because of the amount of moisture in and around the area. Bryce is asking this, can we comment on what appears to be an anomalous, and I think we've already talked about this a little bit, but the anomalous, he calls it out of bounds level of Pacific energy that is out there. The Sierras, California, are going to get or forecast to get a bunch of snow, trough off the west coast all the way to the Aleutians. It's very impressive for this time of year. I agree. And then it's also impressive like I mentioned earlier, the subtropical high over the southeast. And I don't know what to say about anomalousness about that. Usually around now, the west coast, at least California and the southwest, really start drying out and getting hot in May. Any comment from anyone about that, Jim or Dennis or Martha?
This is Jim here. The only thing I would say is that we've done some research and published on the idea that when we're in an overall warmer pattern over the northern hemisphere, you have a much more active west-east flow, and that allows these storms to repeat over and over and over. Where when it's cooler, it's what we call meridional, or a little bit more not as active, and storms are more. It's one place is dry, one place is wet, and we're clearly seeing that very active weather pattern driving across the Pacific into the U.S., which kind of fits into that work.
Okay. Some next question is, some ag marketers are saying that millions of acres may not get planted. Is that accurate?
I won't speculate on numbers, but there are an awful lot of acres that will likely not be planted because they're not planted now. They are, in some, given some of the rainfall amounts, they may not be ready to plant for another couple weeks. And if you're at that point, you are at a point where you're well into your ability to claim prevent plant. And so, yeah, won't speculate on numbers, but definitely there will be a lot of acres that don't get planted.
Yeah, and let me just comment that one of the people on this webinar commented that certainly south of Omaha, well, even north of Omaha, in the Missouri River Basin or floodplain or whatever, there's a lot of actually moving and standing water still there. So it is, I don't know how many acres it's going to be, but there certainly will be some of that area. There's just no way, for a number of reasons, that are going to get planted this year. So in other words, in some areas that are still underwater are not likely to get a lot of attention in terms of planting.
Doug, and then one more thing, a lot of the acreage that has not been planted is further north in the Corn Belt. Their season is more limited, and one of the options is, if it does dry out enough at some point to plant, you see if you can get your hands on a shorter variety that doesn't take as long to mature. Martha was alluding to this. You may not be able to have access to that, a shorter season variety because of the overall delay in planting. And farther north, there may not be enough time to put something in. So you just say, I have to try to claim prevent plant and take my insurance settlement.
I just want to mention in Nebraska, a local issue that we're dealing with because of the March flood is not standing water, but sand. So fields that were underwater and sand, some fields, and it's not necessarily widespread, but some do have up to a foot or more of sand on them, as well as debris. So there's even the case where that's going to prevent people from planting this year.
I just got some statistics in from someone at the USDA, and they said that in 93 and in 95, and those were both very wet years, there were approximately 3 million acres of corn that didn't. We lost more than 3 million acres of corn in 93 and 95. I do believe that weren't planted. So that's just a comparison to a few years, or 20 years ago, 24 years ago. I think I had another question. Oh, yes. The comparison to 1993 and to 2011, are there any? And the only comparisons I can quickly draw is that, yes, both of those years were very, very wet. But if you're asking from a meteorological or climatological point of view, if they are similar, they really are not so far. Although some of the results for those 2 years do appear to be similar. Anybody want to say any more about that?
With the Quad Cities, they beat their Mississippi flow record from 1993, so there is a comparison that way. The thing you have to remember about 1993 is that we stayed very wet throughout June and July. So we right now look like we're going to stay wet, but if we're going to be very wet through that period of time, that we can't quite tell that. So there are going to be some similarities, but the situation is not exactly the same as it was in '93.
Okay. Okay, a little more clarity on the number of acres. 3.2 million acres of corn in 1993 versus final planting acreage and 3.8 million acres in 1995. Okay. So anyway. Any other comments, questions from the group? The next 2 weeks, even though I jumped the gun a bit on Martha, and apologize for that, Martha, showing that the sort of hazards, it's fairly obvious that not only over the next 7 days, but the next 2 weeks, potentially the next 3 months, are leaning towards being wetter than normal. There are definitely going to be consequences of that. From an agriculture, but also from many other sectoral points of view. We will continue to monitor the situation and get out as much information as we can. We definitely will be doing another one of these webinars at least in June 20th, I believe it is. I should also want to mention very quickly, if anybody's interested in the Great Lakes, we are trying to put together another informational webinar that will be sometime in June, perhaps June 10th. That's what we're pointing at right now, to talk about the excessive lake levels or near record to record lake levels in that neck of the woods. So stay tuned for a lot more stuff, I hope, coming out of our shops, and appreciate you guys. Oh, we have another question. Is there a threat of disease pressure due to the wetness, Dennis?
Yes. Anytime you see increased wetness, you increase disease potential, because you have more time for water to be sitting on crops. More humid conditions allows dew to sit longer on crops, and you have more disease potential. And in some cases where we have crops that are slow coming out of the ground, they may not be as healthy. Crops that are not as healthy are more disease prone.
All right. Thank you all, and we will talk to you next month.